I want to start first, though, with my colleague Rachel Maddow, host of MS Now's The Rachel Maddow Show. Rachel, thank you for joining us and welcome to the show. You've been following this all morning. What do you make of this? It's a very, very big development in a months-long effort against Venezuela.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really interested to hear what the president has to say in his remarks from the White House that are planned for just a little under an hour from now. Ali, I feel like in your heart of hearts, when you think about what the United States just did, I think there are very few Americans right now who have any idea why the United States did this. If this was about drug trafficking, then why did President Trump just pardon the former president of Honduras, who was convicted of sending hundreds of tons of drugs into the United States? If this was about something about the illegitimacy of Maduro's election, well, that's something that the U.S. is, decrying any other country policing. We just sanctioned Brazil for having tried to protect itself from a coup by its former president, Jair Bolsonaro. I mean, if it's about gangs, we had the president of El Salvador, who is believed by U.S. law enforcement to be very linked with the notorious gang MS-13, which has caused incredible damage in the hemisphere, including in the United States. He's invited into the Oval Office, and the president says that he's looking forward to sending homegrown Americans to that president's essentially, jungle concentration camps. So all of the purported explanations for what's happened here don't stand up to logical scrutiny. The president has never articulated a coherent rationale for having done this. This seems like Marco Rubio's dream, not Donald Trump's dream. So I'll be very interested to hear what the president is able to piece together in terms of an articulable rationale for having done this. That said, he's done it. And so, in the immortal words of General Colin Powell, you break it, you own it. And it's one thing to do that on the other side of the world. It's another thing to do that so close to home here in our hemisphere. I don't know if they have any plan for what to do now that they have invaded, bombed, and removed the president of that country. But I'll be happy to hear an America First rationale for it, whatever it is.
And the administration kind of sort of laid a little bit of it out in its national security strategy that it came out with a little while ago, this whole concept, sort of a renewal of the Monroe Doctrine, that what happens in our hemisphere is our business and what happens elsewhere is someone else's business. That said, this is the interesting question. Donald Trump wanted to get rid of Maduro in his first term. Marco Rubio, as you said, is very determined to have gotten rid of Maduro and says that there's nothing else to happen now that they've got him. The question is what happens, because Venezuela is a tricky country, and we don't necessarily know what the plan is hereafter.
Exactly. I mean, the president in his remarks on Fox and Friends this morning, which is still just an astonishing choice by a president to have done this before he formally addresses the nation. He called into Fox and Friends and effused about how he felt like he was watching a television show when he was watching the feed of what was going on there, which is it's just disheartening to have a president who has that kind of a mindset about these things. But he also said, essentially sort of ad-libbing, trying to explain why this was a good thing, that, in Venezuela, he was essentially a dictator, as if that was the justification for the United States going in there and physically removing the president of that country. I mean, nobody thinks that Maduro is a good guy or has a lot of confidence in the way that he was holding on to power. But again, the president of El Salvador calls himself, the world's coolest dictator, or whatever it is, that phrase is that he uses for himself. There's lots of countries around the world with de facto, arguable, or official dictatorships. If it is now the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine that we invade and remove the leadership of every country where that's true, it's going to be a very different term in office, and it's going to be a very different world than the one that America First Donald Trump ran on. I mean, the whole justification for J.D. Vance's selection onto the vice presidential ticket was supposedly his distaste for and commitment against America getting involved in regime change wars. And now here's J.D. Vance out tweeting about this, again, before the president speaks to the nation about it, pounding his chest about how awesome this is. It's just whatever you thought you were buying when you bought this presidency, this was not what they had on offer.
So there are a few issues here that you bring up. The perceived illegitimacy of the Maduro government. Fair enough. The idea that he's an authoritarian, also fair enough. We don't often succeed in the second part of this, the regime change part, but it's not even obvious that that's happened. For instance, we're getting reporting that the vice president of Venezuela may be in Russia at this point. But this isn't necessarily regime change. This is the capturing of Maduro, who will be arraigned in New York and a trial. But we're not sure that we got regime change. And there's those who argue that probably shouldn't be a goal of ours anyway, because sometimes we end up getting mired. As you said, you broke it, you bought it. Venezuela is a country of 28 million people, many of whom are impoverished with out of control inflation. We may have just bought ourselves a big problem.
Yeah. I mean, part of the idea of you break it, you bought it, the Pottery Barn Rule problem, right, for wars that we got involved with in the Middle East and in landlocked Central Asia, was that we were setting off chains of events and generational consequences in a region that were eventually going to have blowback throughout that region and maybe even here. But when you're talking about our own hemisphere, once you start doing that here, I mean, we already are incredibly intertwined in terms of our fates with Central and South America. All of the Donald Trump agenda about immigration is driven at core by conditions in countries, in many cases in Central and South America, that drive migration flows to this country for people who are looking for a better life. Well, if we're going to start invading and removing the presidents of countries in Central and South America, that is going to not exactly be a stabilizing factor in terms of what happens with migration flows, with economic integration, with gangs, with with transnational cartel behavior, with drug flows. Again, like if we felt that the Trump administration was full of the most sober, prudent technocrats in the world, right? If they really were the best and brightest in an unironic sense, this would be an incredibly risky thing to do. But instead, it's these guys. And, you know, if you trust the former Fox and Friends weekend host, who's now our defense secretary, to be managing what may be an open-ended commitment here, to manage the fallout from what we have just started and apparently have set the precedent that we're willing to do anywhere, you know, I congratulate you. I don't think a lot of Americans, even Americans who are celebrating the end of Maduro's regime, I don't think a lot of people have a lot of confidence in the Trump administration as it's currently constituted to manage what may be a fairly wild series of consequences here.
And by the way, even if you did have faith, historically, when we've gotten involved in regime change, you know, two things can happen. You can either stabilize a country in a region through regime change, or you can destabilize it. More often than not, we've destabilized it. Even when sober people are in charge of the operation. You bring up an important point that people have been talking about this, or this administration has been referring to Venezuela as a source of drugs. They did the same thing with Canada. It's not entirely accurate. But more importantly, the immigration issue. Venezuela is so destabilized. If it becomes more destabilized, what it does is it causes, Colombia has seen this, Colombia is moving troops to its border because they're expecting an outflow of asylum seekers and refugees who also try and make it to the United States.
Yeah. And again, like, what exactly is the rationale here for these actions? I mean, consider Brazil, right? I mean, Brazil had a sort of Trump-ish authoritarian leader in Jair Bolsonaro who tried to pull off the same kind of effort at a coup that President Trump tried on January 6th. It didn't succeed. He was prosecuted, and the U.S. has now sanctioned Brazil in punishment for having tried to protect its election system from an effort at violent overthrow. Now, if the idea is that Venezuela deserved this bombing and invasion and the removal of its president because of an unfair election there, or because of a contested election there, or because of the dictatorial rule of Maduro, well, you know, okay, now do Brazil. You know, why would we be taking completely opposite takes on these pretextual issues with different South American and Central American countries? How do you have the MS-13 linked president of El Salvador in the U.S. Oval Office with that, you know, with all of the the pledges of friendship and us sending people from the United States into one of his prisons if the issue is gangs? How do you have the Honduran former president pardoned inexplicably by Donald Trump after he put some of Trump's friends on his payroll, after that guy was convicted of smuggling hundreds of tons of cocaine into the United States? I mean, none of what we have learned, I think, for multiple administrations, for multiple bad foreign policy decisions in our country, is that when the things they are saying are the reasons for their actions are proven to not be the reasons for their actions, you have to ask yourself what it's really for. And in this case, I hope we learn something real about that from this president this hour.
Colonel Jack was talking to me before we started the show, and one of the points that he was making is that when pressuring a country, whether you are wanting to achieve regime change or some sort of stability, there's usually a mix of diplomatic and economic action and perhaps the threat of military action. This has been a very unusual situation. We have 15,000 troops off of the coast of Venezuela. We've got an aircraft carrier strike group. We've got F-35s in Puerto Rico. This is set up to be a very big military action. Now, Marco Rubio says that's probably done with. They've got Maduro, and I don't know whether that means the boat's all turned back. But this has not been... There was more headroom available on the diplomatic front and the economic front. And Donald Trump did say that Maduro was prepared to talk and that they were talking and that there was some possibility of a surrender. We're not quite sure how this all happened because they're talking about a capture, that they dragged him out of his bedroom. There's a way this could have worked out differently.
Yes, absolutely. And again, we don't know the justification for the action overall. We also don't know the justification for these tactics in particular, for this type of action, this type of raid and seizure of that country's leader, the way that we've seen it. And maybe we will get that explanation from the president. We shall see. But I mean, stepping back from this a little bit, Ali, I also think, I'm cognizant of what we have been talking about for the last year since Trump has been back in office and what type of leader he appears to want to be. And he is not unique. He is not, this is not the first sort of iteration of this type of leader we have seen around the world. And one thing that we know about this type of sort of would-be strongman is that questions of legality and illegality are ones that he... that may play differently for him than they would for a non-strongman leader. For example, I think that to the extent that this can be defined in the United States as having been an illegal action, I actually think Trump will see that as a political plus, and he will lean into that. He will not care about, not only will he not care about people saying this is illegal, he'll see that as an asset and he'll want to play that up. I also think that would-be strongmen and authoritarian leaders like to start wars. They like to start wars, I think, both for ego and sense of purpose, but also because they like the expanded powers that war tends to give leaders domestically at home against their own political opponents.
Even though he says he doesn't. He says that's not his thing, right? He's still jockeying for that Nobel Peace Prize nomination.
Yeah. It's hard to get a Nobel Peace Prize when you're starting wars and invading other countries. But, I suppose if anybody thinks he can do it, it's probably President Trump.
One of the things that David Rode, who's with us this morning, was pointing out is that it's not clear yet, but it does seem like congressional authorization was not sought for this action. But that's par for the course, to your point, right? Donald Trump, if he thinks the law is in his way as it relates to military action, Congress is where that law is, where you bump up against that law. So he may not be as troubled by it. But this morning we're hearing from members of Congress, we'll have some on the show, and from members of the Senate from both parties who feel that the bombing of those boats off of Venezuela was illegal and that this may itself be illegal. That used to be relevant. That used to be a big conversation that would occupy a lot of our thought. Seems to just play a smaller role these days.
Yeah, two things. One is that I think a lot of previous presidents have broken those rules, and so we inherit from President George H.W. Bush and Panama, right? Like we inherit from George W. Bush in terms of his invasion, right? We inherit a presidential sense of entitlement around war powers that is totally unjustified by the Constitution. This is what I wrote my first book about. But it's something that's been eroding for a long time, this idea that Congress controls whether or not we go to war. And I sincerely hope that in my lifetime we will get back to the founders' vision of who's supposed to declare war and how we're supposed to do it. But Donald Trump won't be the one to have broken that. But on a second point, Ali, I really feel like what we've seen with the boat strikes and what we've seen with the president's domestic agenda is that if he had a choice to do this within the law or a choice to do it blatantly flouting the law, he would choose the latter. Because I think he thinks that makes him seem strong, and because I think he thinks that essentially doesn't just break the law in the sense of violating the law, it breaks the law in terms of its ability to constrain him in the future. And I think that this president does not feel bound by the laws established by the United States Congress, nor does he particularly feel bound by the rulings of most U.S. courts. And so I think that he'll see illegality in this case as a plus. And he will hope that the debate domestically about what he's just done is about the constitutionality of his actions, because I think he'd proudly proclaim that he's acting outside the Constitution and hope to turn that to political capital in a sort of strongman narrative that he's so obviously enamored of in this second term.
Tonight, leaders around the world are denouncing Trump's actions in Venezuela, and many of them are not particularly surprising. I mean, leaders from dictator-loving regimes like China, Cuba, Iran, and Russia condemn the operations against Venezuela, perhaps not a surprise. And understandably, so did other countries in the region that Trump has basically put on notice that they could be next, like Mexico and Colombia. And look, these military strikes are less than 24 hours old, and it may take days or weeks to fully understand the impact globally. But we know lots of people are watching. We know Vladimir Putin is watching. We know Xi Jinping is watching. And my question is, what are they thinking? And what impact could this all have? And I have the perfect person to ask. Joining me now is Michael McFaul, former U.S. ambassador to Russia and MS Now international affairs analyst. Ambassador, you always often make this point that when the United States takes actions, the world watches. It's not like they happen in a vacuum. You think so much about this globally, but let me just start with Vladimir Putin, somebody you have spent a fair amount of time with, a fair amount of time thinking about, and how you think he digested the events of the last 24 hours.
Well, first, Jen, fantastic show tonight. I've been watching most of it because I've been toggling between you and the 49ers game, and your show is a lot more interesting than my hapless 49ers. So thank you for that.
Sorry about your 49ers, but thank you for that, and thank you for being here.
You've had some fantastic guests. First, let's start with Putin. So it's a mixed bag for Putin, because on the one hand, he's seen another one of his allies be dethroned, be deposed, just like happened to Assad last year. That's not good. If you side with Putin and he doesn't do anything for you, that's a bad signal for him on the one hand. But on the other hand, the more important hand for him, it just means that we're all the same. It means, we have our sphere of influence. We're going to go into Venezuela. I have my sphere of influence in Ukraine. Xi Jinping has his sphere of influence when it comes to Taiwan. And that is a horrible world that we don't want to return to. It makes this a unilateral use of force without any reference at all to international norms and institutions. And I think that ends tragically, not just for the United States, but for the entire international system.
It's an excellent point, important for people to remember that none of these things happen in a vacuum. People watch them, and it has impacts, and we'll see that play out over the coming weeks and months. I saw you today, I think you posted or you tweeted or you X'd or whatever we're calling it these days, about how striking it was to you how Trump kind of threw the opposition leader, Maria Corina Machado, under the bus. And of course, she did win the Nobel Prize. Maybe that was under his skin. But in case people haven't seen it, I just wanted to just play that moment and talk to you a little bit about it on the other side.
I think it would be very tough for her to be the leader. She doesn't have the support within or the respect within the country. She's a very nice woman, but she doesn't have the respect.
Now, I mean, he has kind of put all of his eggs in the basket of the vice president, now is the acting president, which was a choice, and a choice that kind of blew up in his face. But tell us a little bit more about what you made of what he had to say about the opposition leader there.
Honestly, I was completely shocked. That Machado, she reminds me of Zelensky, right? She has to make good, talk to the president. She's engaged with them. And at this moment, which is euphoric. I know people that work in the Democratic opposition in Venezuela that work for her. This was a euphoric moment for them until that press conference, because they thought this was going to lead to the peaceful transition. Remember, they already had election. Gonzalez in her party already won a free and fair election. We all acknowledged it. Except for one guy, the president of the United States of America. When he says she doesn't have the support in the country, there's no empirical basis for that comment. And it is just so symbolically damaging to the Venezuelan opposition. It was just a huge leg up now for the Maduro regime that he is now working with. So I hope it's just the first day. I hope there can be a pacted transition, as there have been in other countries, but you wouldn't listen to that press conference and think that President Trump cares about democracy, and that is in the context of a president who for 5 years, his entire first term and his first year of his second term, has never cared about promoting democracy abroad.
I didn't even mention it today. I mentioned oil maybe more than a dozen times. I was just speaking with Barbara McQuaid about this, but the UN, of course, as you've seen, is expressing alarm over this. UN Secretary General released a statement earlier saying the U.S. actions, quote, constitute a dangerous precedent. I'm wondering kind of what worries you, because we all have to worry in these moments about what message this sends to other countries about arresting opponents, not only here, but overseas. I mean, how do you think about that?
Just as you and Barbara were talking about it, super dangerous precedent. By the way, I've been indicted by the Russians. So when I have to think about things like that, you know, if it's a lawless world now and anybody can do anything in the name of national security or protecting their people in these very flimsy arguments, I think it just leads to a much more anarchic world. And that in the long term doesn't serve the interests of the United States of America. We've been there. We've done that. We fought World War II to end that kind of war. And to be sure, there's lots of hypocrisy and lots of contradictions during the Cold War and even after the Cold War. But even in those moments, there was some form of legitimacy for the American use of power. At a minimum, even George W. Bush, President Bush, got Congress to support his war in Iraq. When you do this without any legitimacy, it not only undermines our reputation abroad, but it polarizes American society at home. And you've seen that just in the last 24 hours. And that is another gift to Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. If we're fighting amongst ourselves at home, we are not focused on the real threats to America abroad.
Perfect place to end. So much more to talk about in the coming days. Ambassador Michael McFaul, thank you as always.
All right, we are hearing some Republicans speaking out against Donald Trump's plan to, quote, run Venezuela. Congressman Brian Fitzpatrick of Pennsylvania said in a statement, quote, the only country that the United States of America should be running is the United States of America. The United States should join the international community in monitoring and overseeing a free and fair election in Venezuela, allowing the Venezuelan people a pathway to a true democracy. Joining us now is Republican Congresswoman Anna Paulina Luna of Florida. Congresswoman, thank you so much for coming back on the show. Let me start by your reaction to that statement from your colleague. What is your response to the notion that America should be running America, not, as President Trump said, running Venezuela?
I actually happen to be very good friends with Representative Fitzpatrick, and I do think that that is our full intention. As far as I know, it is our objective to bring our guys back home as soon as possible and to ensure that the president of Mexico, who was actually elected, sees a peaceful transfer of power. And so I'm sure that that will happen hopefully sooner rather than later.
The president of the United States today said that it was the vice president, Delcy Rodriguez. You're saying it's not Delcy Rodriguez. Are you on the same page as the president, or are you aspiring for something different for Venezuela?
I'm on the same page as the president, but what I will say is that we know for a while that the international community has not recognized Maduro and that his entire administration, as well as their election process, was essentially stolen from the people of Venezuela. And so I have all the faith in the world that the peaceful transition of power will happen. And you're actually seeing an overwhelming amount of support from the people, not just in Venezuela, but also Venezuelan Americans here that support what the president has done.
But Congresswoman, if you're on the same page as the president, that doesn't quite align, because the Venezuelan people, both here in the United States and in that country, they support Machado, who Trump said in the presser this morning he actually thinks doesn't have the respect inside the country. And he is in touch with, coordinating with, it sounds like Rubio is, with Delcy Rodriguez, who is implicated in all the same crimes that Maduro has taken part in. Venezuelans that I've spoken to say that she is implicated in all of it, that she's responsible for jailing and harming dissidents in the country. And so the idea that the U.S. is coordinating with her right now is incredibly alarming to them. And that's even Venezuelans who support this president. They're a bit alarmed by what he said about Delcy Rodriguez today.
I haven't heard that same reaction, so that's interesting that you guys are getting a 180 out reaction. But it is interesting to note that most mainstream sources are not pointing out the fact that Maduro, if you want to talk about ultimately why the United States has done what we've done, aside from him being literally a narco trafficker, actually put out an active hit on Marco Rubio when he was a then senator. And so you're seeing that the government of Venezuela currently, I do think, has still a propaganda campaign in effect to try to make it look like what the United States did was wrong. But ultimately, again, it's the perspective of this administration to get in and ensure that the person who is rightfully elected is put into power and then ultimately bring our guys back home. I don't necessarily think it's a long-term plan in staying there, and I certainly would not support that. But I do know that this president had made numerous efforts to reach out and talk directly with Maduro and his, if you want to call it an administration, which, again, I don't think that Maduro was legitimately elected. And ultimately, I do think that the Secretary of State is doing exactly what he is doing to further our efforts and our safety for the American people.
Do you really feel that the president is focused on free and fair elections? Because in his presser this morning, he used the word oil 20 times. He mentioned wealth 2 times. He mentioned drugs 4 times. But he said the word democracy 0 times. He said free or fair elections 0 times. He didn't really make his major speech to the country this morning about the freedom and liberty of Venezuelans at all.
Well, you know, I did watch his press conference, and I'm not the president's speechwriter, but what I will tell you is when he was pointing out the fact that Nicolas Maduro is actively a narco trafficker, that he ultimately is responsible for the death of many Americans. And again, I don't know why the mainstream media is not talking about this, but when Secretary Rubio was a senator, Nicolas Maduro put out a hit on the secretary. So as far as I'm concerned, even if we did play on the,
we know that Maduro is not a good guy.
Play on the same parallel as the international courts, they would also say that that's literally an act of war to do against a sitting Secretary of State. But the point would be is that I believe that the president absolutely has an invested interest. Look, we don't need Venezuela's oil. We have our Permian Basin. We're perfectly good to go here. But ultimately, again, I think President Trump is doing will stabilize the United States for generations to come. And it will ultimately be responsible for many Americans not dying from fentanyl overdoses, et cetera. It has been interesting to note, though, that you're seeing the president and many countries that have been run by cartels, for example, Mexico, react in a negative light as opposed to countries like Argentina, for example.
Okay, so 2 things. Did you read the indictment that was unsealed by Pam Bondi?
I read some of it, and I know on, I think it's one of the first pages that cocaine is referenced.
Okay. Fentanyl is not mentioned in that, and neither is this alleged hit that you're talking about Nicolas Maduro putting out on Senator Marco Rubio. Why would the Trump administration not indict him on what you're making to be a huge claim by an adversary of the United States against a sitting U.S. senator? Why do you think they didn't?
It's definitely an important piece of information, and I will make sure that I follow up with Todd Blanche and suggest that they try to charge him for that as well.
That's not what you're saying. You're justifying the actions of the administration. You're justifying the actions of the administration by citing fentanyl and citing an alleged hit on Senator Marco Rubio. Both of those.
Fentanyl and cocaine and drugs have been definitely trafficked out of Venezuela.
Fentanyl is not mentioned at all in the indictment against Nicolas Maduro.
I'm actually telling you confirmed information. I'm telling you confirmed information. So what I would do if I were you is I would reach out to the Secretary's office and see if Nicolas Maduro put out a hit on him. And I just said that I would follow up with the DOJ.
I'm just telling you it's not mentioned in the indictment, and I'm asking you to explain why it's not mentioned in the indictment.
Department of Justice. I don't know. I don't work at the Department of Justice, but I think that would be a good thing for you guys to follow up on. Do you think maybe it's not a real thing do you think it's maybe not a real thing that they have any evidence to substantiate it? No, I don't think that it's not a real thing. I think it definitely happened, and I definitely confirmed it with 2 separate people before I came onto your show because I wanted to share that with you. And I would suggest that you guys follow up with the Secretary's office because I do think that that's something that the American people should know.
The Secretary has an open invitation to come on this show at any time. I can promise you that. I want to know what your message is, Congresswoman, to your voters, to people who are part of the MAGA movement, who voted for Trump because he and people around him said consistently during the campaign that we were getting out of forever wars, we were not going to be spending American taxpayer dollars overseas, that he was going to be focused, laser focused on making life affordable here. I spoke to people on the campaign trail who believed in the president on that issue, who maybe had scarring experiences or their kids had scarring experiences serving abroad in Iraq and Afghanistan, and they didn't want anything like that to happen. And we're already seeing that some of them are fearful that what we heard described earlier today, if the U.S. is running Venezuela for a certain period of time, not indefinitely, if the U.S. is going to have to worry about transporting oil, sort of resetting up refineries there, that's going to require a lot of boots on the ground. Is it not?
Well, look, I'm a United States Air Force veteran. My husband was shot in Afghanistan, so obviously we're not for forever wars. However, from my understanding, the president was talking about private investment. So I obviously am not in the administration, but based on his own statements, I would assume that that's not taxpayer dollars, that that's actually.
But what's your message to voters who say this is not what I voted for?
Aside from that, I'll get to that in a second. Aside from that, this time last year when President Biden was still in office prior to the November elections, we actually had oil in Pinellas County over $3 a gallon. Now it's under $2 and some change, right, in various areas. We saw egg prices that have now gone down. And what I will tell you is the president's perspective and this administration's perspective is peace through strength. And your sons and daughters will not be drafted into another foreign war. But aside from that, literally a few weeks ago, I was on a ride along and we found 2 pounds of fentanyl in the last couple of weeks. Our Florida Department of Corrections found that during these various probation check-ins. That's enough to kill more people in Pinellas County multiple times over. So when you're talking about the president's war on drugs, essentially stopping the Maduro regime from trafficking drugs into this country, I'm very glad that he did what he did because he essentially saved people in Pinellas County.
A lot of experts are concerned that this is going to cause destabilization, not just for Venezuelans who may have to deal with a power vacuum for a period of time, but in Colombia, in Cuba, and elsewhere. Are Republicans considering maybe reversing their actions on TPS, for example, and making it easier for those people to come to the United States right now if their home countries are destabilized because of the action that we have taken?
What's interesting is because of President Trump's actions, I actually saw reports today from a local Florida outlet that there are some former, I guess, Venezuelan refugees that are looking to head back home now because Maduro has been essentially removed and brought back to the United States. But also, too, I don't know, and I don't necessarily think that there will be a destabilization in these other countries, Mexico, Cuba, et cetera. Again, I don't have a crystal ball, but it's not the perspective and directive of the administration to cause such. But what I will also say is that when you have people that have countries that are run by cartels and they've been sending their people over here, they're essentially responsible for drug running and they're not wanting to work with the U.S. government, I think that that's a different story. And so I'm obviously not for any more foreign intervention, but I also understand the behind the scenes conversations and also the intelligence reports that went into this. This is not a decision that was made lightly. And I do think that the administration is sending a very powerful signal internationally to the international community not to mess with the United States.
Really quickly, did you support the pardoning of the Honduran president for narco trafficking and being sentenced for 45 years in the United States? Do you support that decision by President Trump or not?
I never issued a statement on that, and I'm not a huge fan of pardoning any narco traffickers, period. But again, I'm not the president, and based on what his decision processing was for that.
Okay. Congresswoman Anna Paulina Luna, thank you so much. We really appreciate you coming on and taking our questions.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. God bless.
As we go now to Massachusetts Democratic Congressman, our friend Seth Moulton. He is a member of the House Armed Services Committee. Welcome, sir. You have called this, quote, reckless elective regime change risking American lives. So first off, what have you learned over the course of this day? And have you learned anything that changes your mind about whether this action was justified?
I mean, all those things are right, but maybe it's simpler to just say, Alex, this is insane. What are we doing? I mean, this is absolutely ridiculous. Have we not learned the lessons of the last 20 years of forever wars? We have a lot of problems in America today. And putting troops on the ground to occupy and run Venezuela does not solve any of them. In fact, it probably makes instability worse in the region. It makes it more likely that refugees and drugs will come from Venezuela. And when the president says that he's going to fix the government and install the rightful leader, well, that doesn't seem to be in the plans now because he's not actually interested in installing the opposition leaders who won the election. So that's not democracy. And you don't get to just invade a country when you don't like the leader and want its oil.
Interestingly, White House Chief of Staff Susie Wiles told Vanity Fair last month that attacking targets on Venezuela's mainland would, in fact, require Trump to get congressional approval. Does that tell you the administration knows they're defying the law here?
Yes. And they defy the law with abandon, Alex, and they do not care. So it's no surprise. In fact, the only surprise was that Susie Wiles was honest enough to tell the truth, that they do need to come to Congress. And that's why I wrote the legislation that says that we will not spend taxpayer funds, your dollars, on ground operations in Venezuela without a vote. We need to have that vote in Congress. I mean, it's a bit late now. Speaker Johnson should have brought that bill to the floor a long time ago, but we should still have that vote because it's extraordinary how many parallels there are here with Iraq, right? I mean, there were no WMD in Iraq. That's what Bush used to justify the war. Trump makes up the idea that fentanyl is WMD, even though it doesn't happen to come from Venezuela. This is a war about regime change. This is a war about oil. This is a war where Trump, just like Bush, says, we're going to take over the country and run it, and everything's going to be fine. This is Iraq 2.0, no matter how you look at it. But at least with Iraq, Congress did actually have a debate and vote on the war. Now, there are a lot of people in Congress, some of them still there today, who took the wrong vote when it came to sending young Americans like myself into harm's way in Iraq. But at least Congress weighed in. Congress has not weighed in at all on this. In fact, the times the administration has come to us, they've just lied about what they intended to do.
And last month, sir, the House narrowly rejected a war powers resolution that would have directed the removal of U.S. armed forces from hostilities involving Venezuela, which haven't been authorized by Congress. Is this the very kind of action that resolution sought to prevent?
It is, but war powers resolutions can only technically stop action after it's started. And that's why I wrote a bill to say we will not allow taxpayer funds to go into future operations on the ground in Venezuela. So there's some legal differences here in the technicalities. But guess what? Even if Congress did take that vote and said, you know, well, a bunch of Republicans kind of like what's going on, the illegal boat killings off the shores of Venezuela, so we're not going to outright stop it today, that doesn't authorize you to start a war. Okay, this is the kind of stuff that thugs and dictators like Vladimir Putin do. They just invade Ukraine because we like their natural resources and we don't like the leader. It's not what the United States of America does. It does not further democracy. It does not make the world more peaceful and stable. It certainly doesn't earn you a Nobel Peace Prize. I mean, this is utterly reckless on every level. And it's putting American troops and U.S. taxpayer dollars at tremendous risk, all the while distracting attention from all the problems that Trump has going on here at home.
So prior to the news conference that began at Mar-a-Lago about 3 hours ago, sir, Republican Senator Mike Lee says that he was told directly by Secretary of State Marco Rubio that there would be no further action in Venezuela now that Maduro is in custody. Do you believe that's true? Because as my colleague Rachel Maddow, citing Colin Powell, said earlier, you break it, you fix it. I mean, what are the next steps for the U.S. here? What does the president mean when he says the U.S. will run Venezuela?
I mean, look, anyone who believes Marco Rubio at this point is really out to lunch. It's absolutely shameful that the Senate confirmed him to this job, a job we are supposed to extend the trust of the United States via your own personal trust to foreign leaders all across the world. Rubio came to Congress and lied to us when he said this is not about regime change, lied to us when he said they're not going to do ground operations in Venezuela, lied to us when he said this was just about killing narco traffickers on the boats, lied to us when he said that that would stop drugs coming into America. I mean, let's not be so naive. You cannot trust Rubio. You cannot trust Trump. And we have no idea what's coming next. They have not been honest about their goals at any point in this operation. So no, of course you cannot trust what they're saying will happen next.
Okay. Democratic Congressman Seth Moulton, always grateful to have your voice on the show. Thank you so much, sir.